So I want to give my thoughts and do a review on the two-part season 2 premiere of Dark Side of the Ring, covering the Chris Benoit tragedy. If you haven't seen this documentary yet, it's 2 parts. It's on YouTube, on the Vice channel, and it's also on Vice.com. It's season 2 of Dark Side of the Ring, which is like a bunch of little mini documentaries about, tragedies and stories of the dark side of wrestling. That's pretty much what it is. Now, the Benoit murder-suicide transcended the business because it was the darkest day, not including like an accidental death, like the passing of Owen Hart or even somebody passing of old age, which is a very dark day. But this was very, very different because this was something that involved, like with Owen Hart's passing, it was an accident, and I'm sure there's probably people who remember that vividly, and I certainly do. It was a tragedy, and, he left behind, children and whatnot. And Chris Benoit left behind kids too, but the murder-suicide with Benoit was worse because he murdered his wife and his 7-year-old son. His wife, Nancy's 7-year-old son, Daniel. Nancy, of course, being known in the wrestling business as a woman who was a manager in the business for, in ECW, WCW, the Florida territory. She basically, was killed by Chris Benoit. So I want to talk about this documentary and kind of give my thoughts on it and give my thoughts on the overall package. So first and foremost, this documentary is, as I said, 2 parts. So it's 2 hours. It was very well done. And one thing I did like about it is the people who they got to be on it. They got Vicky Guerrero to be on this, Chavo Guerrero, and Chris Jericho, also Dean Malenko, people who knew Chris Benoit very well. And they had some really eye-opening things, not to mention family members like Chris Benoit's older son was on here, David, as well as Nancy's sister. So the group of people who were interviewed for this, I thought was effective. And then in part 2, to my surprise, they also interviewed Matthew Randazzo V, the author, as well as Chris Nowinski. And I was very happy to see them there as well give their 2 cents. So I want to talk about some things that kind of surprised me. So obviously, I would assume most of you listening to this already know about the Benoit murder-suicide. And if you don't, there are several books out there, several videos out there about it. But one thing that to me stood out about the first part, just part 1, was how much time they spent talking about Eddie Guerrero. Because obviously Eddie Guerrero's passing was also really sad, really tragic. I lived through that as well. But Eddie Guerrero's death sort of became a big changing point in the life of Chris Benoit, which we talked about more in part 2. Chris Benoit never got over it. Eddie Guerrero was like beyond a best friend to him. And I was surprised that they spent so much time talking about the Eddie Guerrero passing in the first part. But I guess it makes sense because they are both kind of linked together. It's one of those things where I kind of feel like the Eddie Guerrero passing almost could have gotten its own episode, but I feel like it did with part 1. And Chavo Guerrero being Eddie's, nephew, Vicky Guerrero, of course, being Eddie's wife when he was alive, because of how close Eddie was to Chris Benoit, their perspective was important. For example, there were stories that were told in this thing that I had no idea about, like, for example, how much of a comforting person Nancy was when Eddie died. Vicky was going through some tremendous, tremendous pain losing her husband, and Nancy came in and kind of became, like her best friend, and really helped her. And so the tragic murder of Nancy probably hit Vicky really, really hard, obviously, but even harder than one would even know unless you knew these kind of behind the scenes stories. We don't really talk about this kind of stuff a lot because this stuff is very personal, and when you have like WWE documentaries and things like that, you don't get that kind of information. But when it comes to Chris Benoit, they're never going to mention him ever again. I mean, it's just, he's been erased from history as much as humanly possible. And they talked about how, Chris Benoit had become a very religious man, because of Eddie Guerrero. And Eddie Guerrero had issues, when he was younger, abuse issues and things like that, with pills and alcohol and whatnot. And he was able to kind of overcome that, with religion, with his faith and his love of his family. And, unfortunately, Eddie still passed away because the damage had been done to his body. He had heart problems. A lot of folks think it's because of steroid abuse and things like that. Eddie was humongous in WWE. They didn't really talk about steroids too much when it came to that, though. But they did discuss steroids as far as Chris Benoit went. And they definitely went into detail about how this act of what he did was not roid rage. I remember when the whole story first happened. And this was when I lost faith in mainstream media. Like, I don't trust the mainstream news, specifically because of the way they cover the Benoit tragedy. Nancy Grace is an absolutely atrocious human being. Same thing with Geraldo Rivera. They are literally jokes, and the fact they are even successful in this business it is an embarrassment to news, because they treated the Benoit murder-suicide so callously without doing one iota of research. And so the big sort of topic was roid rage, and it wasn't roid rage. In part 2, they go into detail about what could have caused Benoit to snap the way he did. And that's when Chris Nowinski kind of stepped in, and Nowinski talked about, obviously what's now become known as CTE in the athletic world, the concussion issue, and how he had his concussions, and that would of course lead to him doing all kinds of research and starting the Chris Nowinski Foundation to eventually help understand this a bit more. And the suicide rate among athletes actually went up quite a bit because of when they discover sort of the connection between suicide and concussion. So now a lot of the athletic, commissions and companies, WWE and the NFL are much more cognizant of concussions because of the Benoit murder-suicide and other NFL players that had concussions that did suicidal things or just had issues. And they talked about how Benoit's brain, when he had died, they discovered that it was the brain of an 88-year-old or an 80-year-old man with Alzheimer's or something like that. But they actually showed a little bit more in this documentary about how Benoit had literal holes in his brain. Now, a lot of this was caused by the bumps he would take in the ring. Of course, the chair shots to the head, which are no longer allowed in WWE. Headbutts from the top rope. Benoit, of course, did a lot of suplexes in his matches, would get dropped on his neck a lot with German suplexes and things of that nature, brain busters, that rough Japanese style. And if you saw Chris Benoit wrestle, you know he never, slacked off. He went 100% every night he wrestled, which made me respect the guy for the majority of his life, He's one of the great all-time wrestlers. You can't take it away from him as far as a worker goes. So, all of that combined with and this is kind of the conclusion of the documentary, combined with his, he was drinking, he was taking steroids. This is not even a secret at this point. He was also taking other medication as well. When you combine all of that together with the depression he went through with the passing of Eddie Guerrero and also his marital problems, because apparently, according to Nancy's sister, they were having fights where Nancy would actually be physically hurt. So I'm not going to sit here and say that Chris Benoit was an abusive husband, because I don't know anything about that family. Obviously, what he did at the end of his life to her was the most abusive thing possible, taking her life. But they already had issues even before that happened. It wasn't like miraculously one day he just snapped. That obviously he did snap, but the way it's portrayed in the documentary was, it was sort of like a slow decline. Like his brain started to literally rot, ladies and gentlemen. It was rotting in the last few years of his life, and the Eddie thing pushed him, and just all these things that were going on in his brain just pushed him. Now again, I'm not in any way justifying what he did, but the idea that it's roid rage is just stupid. That's kind of my point, is that it wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of so many things going on, because there's other athletes and other wrestlers that also have, concussion issues, and a lot of them did take steroids, a lot of them have pill addictions. It's not even a secret in the wrestling business. That's how it is. But, with Benoit, for some reason, it just made him become this. So, of course, the big question's going to be in everyone's mind is, the morality situation. Was Chris Benoit truly a terrible man, or was he not? Well, the acts he did at the end of his life was terrible. But all his friends who knew him, on this documentary, constantly repeat and saying that he was a good guy, that, even his son said that. Now, obviously, when you know somebody on a day-to-day basis like that, and they do something so horrible, it's very hard to cope with it. Right? That's a fact. So a lot of times you will justify their actions, or at least justify them not being who they were. And that's kind of what people have said. Obviously that is the case here. But the main point I'm trying to make with all that is that it was a combination of things that led to this situation. One thing this documentary did that was chilling, this is a very chilling documentary, is that they talked about when the cops first showed up at the house. We have never heard this before, to my recollection. The cops showed up at the house, and they were looking around after getting the call, the welfare check that WWE had called the Atlanta It was right outside Atlanta, Georgia, police department. They went to the house, and there was this chilling story about how she saw a man in a mirror in one of the rooms, which was Chris Benoit, and she was putting her hands up, like, or, you know, with the gun, like, you know, put your hands up, like, basically thinking there was a person who was in there who was alive because they were moving. Turns out that was not, it wasn't Chris Benoit alive, it was Chris Benoit hanging from the weight machine where he had hung himself. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's creepy. It's like something out of a horror movie. Think about that. You know, that was extremely creepy. So, that stood out to me as being like something I had never heard before. Also, and I gotta keep it real with you, yo. Like, we found out that the Benoit family and Nancy's family didn't even receive calls from WWE. Like, Benoit's older son, who's still alive, has been harassed and attacked his whole life because of what his dad did, which is not fair to him at all, yo. Obviously, this is a kid from a different marriage, or a different woman, just so everybody knows. But, like, WWE did not even contact him whatsoever. Like, only, according to what he said in the documentary, the only wrestlers that reached out to him were Chavo Guerrero and Chris Jericho. And also, Chris Jericho here was able to get Nancy's sister and Chris Benoit's son together to, after 13 years of not speaking, to actually form a friendship and form a bond, which was a big part of the last part of part 2. You know, it was just weird to me because, you know, I remember living through the Benoit murder-suicide, and seeing it play out in this documentary was just really chilling, you know, and that was kind of new information as well. We also had not known about Vicky Guerrero's sort of connection to all of this. I might actually go back and watch it again in one big part, because there's a lot of stuff that was covered here that, you know, I had known about some of it, but, you know, there was other stuff that wasn't really discussed too much, and new information. Now, some of the stuff that was left off the documentary, they did talk about how WWE ran cause Jim Ross is on here. They ran the Benoit tribute show, and then they found out, like, the night of the Benoit tribute show, about an hour or half an hour before it ended, that it was actually Benoit that did it, and they kept the show going. And to me, I remember them getting a lot of shit for that, but also what they didn't mention was the fact that Raw was airing in the West Coast on a 3-hour delay. By the time that episode of Raw aired in the West Coast, they had known for sure that Chris Benoit had killed his family, and they still let it air. And that was, to me, a big piece of controversy. Also, there's all kinds of stuff in the Mushnick books, if you haven't read them, about how WWE, there was rumors that there was foul play involving Benoit. There was actually discussions, I remember, that day that Benoit was the one that did it. Even as early as the afternoon, there was talk that, like, there was rumors and discussion internally that he may have been the one to do it, which is why William Regal's, you know, quote, tribute to Benoit on the Benoit tribute show was so weird and chilling, because it really wasn't praising him for being a good guy. It was more so just his work, and it was really weird and different. I remember there being talk that WWE knew at like 2 p.m. that day. Now again, I don't know if that's actually true, but I remember hearing that, shortly after that. But again, that wasn't really discussed here, and they did show that clip from ECW on Sci-Fi the next night when McMahon came out and said, you know, because we found out what really happened, you know, we're not going to mention him ever again, and how he disappeared from the website. I mean, I'll never forget, yo, when he died, before they knew that he was the one that killed himself and his family, I remember there was all these rumors about carbon monoxide, and somebody broke in, and at this point, yo, if you actually believe that Kevin Sullivan did this and framed Chris Benoit, you really shouldn't be allowed to have children or drive or vote. Like, that's the way I feel, because you're just beyond an idiot at this point. You know, let it go. Let it go. And yes, folks, there's people out there who actually believe that Benoit was framed, even though there's all this evidence, especially on this documentary. There's even more evidence that comes out on here that it was him who did it. I mean, it was him. Now, what I was going to say, though, a minute ago was, before they actually found out it was him, I remember his name was all over WWE.com, you know, Chris Benoit. And then when they found out it was him, vanished. It was like Vengeance Night of Champion results, or whatever the case was. That was the pay-per-view that he missed. He was supposed to wrestle CM Punk that night, and I think actually put him over for the ECW title, even though I remember hearing that he was supposed to win that title and then like defend it and kind of help the young guys out. Cause that was his job, to be more of like a trainer wrestler type guy, which he would have been great at because he's a great worker. You know, not everybody's a great trainer who's a great worker, but he certainly knew the business, you know, very well. One thing they did not touch on in this documentary, very briefly maybe with Nancy, but they didn't talk about the fact that Chris was kind of a bully behind the scenes. People don't talk about this, but there have been stories of hazing with wrestlers like Bob Holly and JBL. Obviously, this was years and years and years ago, so I don't hold it against these guys anymore. But, you know, Benoit there were stories of him being kind of a bully, you know, for a long time. They kind of kept that away. But there was a very chilling story about, you know, I mentioned it earlier about like how Nancy would show up with bruises and Rocco Rock, I think it was, or maybe it was Johnny Grunge, but one of the Public Enemy guys had to calm Chris down. Like, the dude was not a perfect person at all, yo. And I understand that a lot of these wrestlers knew the guy, but there's demons here, and it's very creepy. The documentary is very creepy. I was happy that Nowinski got to be in here and kind of tell his story because he has done a lot of work for athletes. But overall, the documentary was fantastic. I really did enjoy it. There's so much more they could have talked about, but it wasn't really necessary. There are books out there that cover it a little bit, you know, more thoroughly. So check that out for sure when you get a chance to. Also, there was a thing on the Vice documentary, like on the Vice YouTube channel, where they interviewed like Tommy Dreamer and Chavo. It's like a post-game show. And it was totally terrible. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. Like, it's called After the Ring or something like that. But basically, they interviewed Tommy Dreamer and Chavo as these two marks. And they just kept trying to put themselves over and put over Chavo and Dreamer instead of asking them real questions. And you could tell that Dreamer was getting kind of annoyed in Chavo. You could tell. Like, it was just really, really poorly done. It wasn't taken very seriously. Like, you have 30 minutes on Skype with Chavo and Dreamer. There's way better questions you can ask them than, you know, talking about how rare it was to get the J-Cup tournament tape. Like, okay, we know that already. We know about how rare the J-Cup tape is, bro, because I got the J-Cup tape. But you don't have to sit there and tell Dreamer how rare it was. Oh, I got the tape. Listen, nobody cares about your collection, bro. Like, I want to hear about Dreamer, because Dreamer at one time was roommates of Chris Benoit. So there's so many stories and so many questions I would have for him about that. And yet these guys goofed around. So that was a waste of time. But if you're going to watch part 1 and part 2 of this documentary on Vice, do it. I do recommend it, but it's very chilling. That's it. If you saw it, let me know what you think down below, and we'll talk soon.